Waking up in a stranger's bed is a cliché. Waking up in a stranger's body, legally married to a billionaire alpha who hates your guts, and finding a divorce settlement on the nightstand, that's just a bad Monday. The original owner of this body spent 3 years begging for scraps of affection from a man made of ice. Me? I just want the alimony and a cab. I have 3 days before the divorce goes public. Let's make it easy. Waking up felt like pulling my brain through a cheese grater. There was no blinding flash of light, no angelic choir, no disembodied voice explaining the cosmic mistake that had ripped my consciousness from a sterile hospital bed and shoved it into this one. There was only the crushing, localized ache behind my left eye and the suffocating smell of bleach and expensive linen. I rolled over. The sheets were silk. Real silk, the kind that snagged on the dry skin of my heels. I groaned, dragging a hand down my face. My fingers felt too thin. My face felt wrong. The bone structure was sharper, the skin impossibly smooth, lacking the familiar rough stubble of a man who spent 60 hours a week staring at spreadsheets. I sat up. The room was massive, decorated in varying shades of corporate depression, charcoal, slate, ash. It looked less like a bedroom and more like a high-end furniture showroom. Then the memories hit. They didn't flood in like a movie montage. They seeped in like cold water under a door. Elias Reed. That was the name attached to this body. 24 years old, an Omega. The scent gland on the back of my neck throbbed, a dull phantom pulse that made my stomach churn. I reached back and touched it. A small, sensitive ridge of flesh. Biological reality crashed over me. I wasn't just in a new body, I was in a new world. A world governed by secondary genders, pheromones, and primal biology that my rational 30-something-year-old brain violently rejected. I swung my legs out of bed. The hardwood floor was freezing. I found the master bathroom, an expanse of marble and glass that could comfortably house a family of 4, and gripped the edges of the sink, staring at the mirror. The kid looking back at me was beautiful in a tragic, porcelain kind of way. Pale skin, dark smudges under hollow eyes, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He looked exhausted. He looked starved. Because he was. The residual memories whispered. Starved for food, trying to maintain a waif-like figure, starved for attention, starved for his alpha, Arthur Hayes. The name tasted like battery acid in my mouth. Arthur Hayes, CEO of Hayes Global, an alpha with a pedigree older than most countries, and a heart rate that probably rested in the low 40s. He had married Elias 3 years ago to fulfill a dying grandfather's wish and secure his majority shares. It was a transaction. Arthur had made that brutally clear on their wedding night, leaving Elias in a hotel suite alone while he flew to Tokyo for a merger. For 3 years, the original Elias had tried to win him over. He baked. He waited up. He wore clothes soaked in his own sweet, desperate pheromones, jasmine and honey, trying to coax a biological reaction out of a man who looked at him like he was a stain on the rug. It was pathetic. It was a waste of a life. And last night, it had culminated in Elias swallowing a handful of sleeping pills with half a bottle of gin. I opened the mirrored cabinet, empty pill bottles. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking slightly. "All right, Elias," I muttered to the glass. My voice was softer than I was used to, slightly raspy from the alcohol. "You checked out. I clocked in. Let's see what kind of mess we're dealing with." I walked back into the bedroom and noticed it. A manila folder sitting dead center on the glass coffee table at the foot of the bed. It hadn't been there in the original Elias's memories of last night. Someone had been in here. I picked it up. The paper was heavy, expensive. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I skimmed the legalese, irreconcilable differences, mutual separation. Arthur's lawyers had drafted it cleanly, no fault, no scandal. And then I hit the settlement clause. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, and read it again. A lump sum of $50 million, the deed to a penthouse in Chelsea, 2 cars, and a monthly stipend that exceeded what I used to make in a decade, all on the condition that the divorce was signed quietly, without contest, and finalized in exactly 3 days, just before the Hayes Global Quarterly Earnings Report. In the residual memory, the original Elias had seen a draft of this document a week ago. He had wept. He had thrown a vase at a wall. He had vowed to tear it up, to force Arthur to stay, to make him love him. I let out a dry, hacking laugh. It echoed in the massive, empty room. $50 million to leave a man who wasn't even home? I would have divorced my own mother for half that. I didn't hesitate. I didn't cry. I didn't smell like wilting jasmine. I walked over to the nightstand, picked up a heavy Mont Blanc pen, flipped to the last page, and signed Elias Reed on the dotted line. I closed the folder. Done. 3 days left on the clock. Now, I just needed some coffee. The kitchen was a chef's wet dream, entirely outfitted in brushed steel and black marble. I spent 20 minutes looking for coffee beans, only to realize the espresso machine was built into the wall and required a touchscreen to operate. I settled for an apple I found in the crisper drawer. It was mealy, but the sugar rush helped dull the headache. I was halfway through eating it, perched on a stool at the island, wearing a pair of overly soft cashmere sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt I'd dug out of the back of the closet, when the front door clicked. The sound of heavy, measured footsteps echoed through the foyer. The air in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't magic. It was the abrupt physical drop in barometric pressure that accompanied an alpha's pheromones. My new biology reacted before my brain did. The skin on the back of my neck prickled. My lungs felt tight. The scent was sharp, oppressive, crushed cedar, frost, and the metallic tang of ozone before a lightning strike. I took a slow breath through my mouth to avoid gagging on the sheer dominance of it, forcing my heart rate to stay steady. Arthur Hayes walked into the kitchen. He looked exactly like the corporate profile pictures floating around in my borrowed memories, only sharper. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a bespoke navy suit that draped perfectly over his frame. His hair was dark and impeccably styled, and his eyes were the color of slate. They were flat, calculating, and entirely devoid of warmth. He stopped in the doorway. His gaze flicked over me. He took in the messy hair, the oversized shirt, the half-eaten apple. His jaw tightened. "I see you're awake," Arthur said. His voice was a low baritone that vibrated in the floorboards. "I assumed you'd be sleeping off your theatrics." He knew about the pills. Of course he did. He probably had his security detail clear the bottles away while I was passed out, leaving the divorce papers in their place, a final blunt message. In the past, this was the cue for Elias to shatter, to launch himself at Arthur, weeping, begging, promising to be better, to be quieter, to be whatever the alpha wanted. I took another bite of the apple, chewed slowly, and swallowed. "I'm awake," I said, my tone mild. I didn't sound desperate, I just sounded tired. Arthur's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the only sign that he had registered the deviation in the script. He walked over to the island, maintaining a distance of at least 5 feet, the standard buffer zone he always kept between them. "Did you read the file on the table?" he asked. "I did." "Then you know my lawyers aren't interested in a protracted negotiation," Arthur said smoothly, slipping his hands into his pockets. "The terms are generous, Elias. More than generous for 3 years of whatever this was. If you drag this into court, I will bury you in legal fees until you have nothing left. Do not test my patience. Sign the papers." I looked at him. Really looked at him. He was a beautiful man, sure, but he looked exhausting. He looked like the kind of boss who emails you at 2 a.m. on a Sunday and expects a reply by 2:05 a.m. I slid off the stool. I walked past him, ignoring the sudden flare of cedar and frost that spiked in the air as I closed the distance, and walked into the hallway. I grabbed the manila folder from the bedroom, walked back into the kitchen, and slid it across the black marble. It stopped right in front of him. "I used the Mont Blanc on your nightstand," I said, leaning my hips against the counter. "Hope you don't mind. The ink is black, so make sure you use black too. Blue ink on legal documents is a pet peeve of mine." Arthur stared at the folder. Then, slowly, he looked up at me. For the first time since I had inherited these memories, Arthur Hayes looked genuinely confused. His alpha pheromones flared, a brief, aggressive spike of dominance, trying to force a submission out of my Omega biology. My knees went slightly weak, a purely involuntary physical response, but I locked my joints. I met his gaze dead on. I didn't bare my neck. I didn't look down. I just stared back with the hollow apathy of a man who had survived 10 years of middle management. "You signed it," Arthur stated. It wasn't a question. "I did. Just like that." "Just like that," I agreed. I tossed the apple core into the stainless steel trash can. It hit the bottom with a loud, hollow thud. $50 million and a penthouse in Chelsea is a good deal, Arthur. I'd have to be stupid to fight it. And I think we're both tired of this. Let's just wrap it up." Arthur didn't touch the folder. He just kept looking at me, his eyes searching my face for the trick. He was waiting for the trap to spring, for the tears to start, for the emotional blackmail. When nothing happened, his confusion morphed back into cold irritation. "You have 3 days to clear your things out of the guest rooms," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I'll be out by tomorrow afternoon," I replied. "But we still have the foundation gala on Friday night. The PR clause in the settlement says we announce the amicable split on Saturday morning. I assume you still want me to attend the gala and smile for the cameras?" Arthur's jaw clenched. "Yes." "Fine. Send me the itinerary. I'll meet you there." I didn't wait for him to dismiss me. I turned my back on the apex predator of the boardroom and walked away. As I rounded the corner, I could still feel the heavy, oppressive weight of his stare burning a hole between my shoulder blades. The air in the kitchen tasted thick, but I breathed a little easier once I was out of his sight. Round 1 was over. Packing up someone else's life is a surreal experience. By noon the next day, I had managed to secure 10 large cardboard boxes from the building's concierge. I stood in the center of the massive walk-in closet and began the purge. The original Elias was a hoarder of memories. Not good memories, because there were none, but scraps of anything Arthur had touched. There were dry cleaning receipts for Arthur's suits, a collection of expensive, hideous pastel sweaters that Elias had bought because an article in Alpha Weekly claimed Alphas preferred soft, delicate colors on their Omegas. There were diaries. God, the diaries. I flipped open one leather-bound notebook. He looked at me during breakfast today. He didn't speak, but his eyes lingered on my hands. I think he noticed the ring. I snapped the book shut, a phantom wave of secondhand embarrassment washing over me. "Jesus Christ, kid," I whispered to the empty room. "You were living on crumbs." I threw the diaries in a heavy-duty trash bag. I threw the pastel sweaters into a donation pile. I threw out the expensive colognes that smelled like synthetic sugar. I stripped the closet down to its bare bones, a few well-tailored trousers, a couple of neutral turtlenecks, a sharp charcoal suit that still had the tags on. I was taping up the 3rd box of donation clothes when the bedroom door opened. "Mr. Reed?" I looked up. Standing in the doorway was a man in his late 20s, holding a tablet to his chest like a shield. Liam, Arthur's executive assistant. He was a beta, immune to the heavy pheromone warfare that usually choked this penthouse, but he still looked terrified. Liam's eyes widened as he took in the industrial garbage bags and the taped boxes. What are you doing?" Liam stammered. "Packing," I said, ripping a strip of packing tape with a loud screech. I slapped it over the cardboard seam. "I'm assuming Arthur sent you to make sure I wasn't stealing the silverware?" Liam flushed deeply. "No, sir. Mr. Hayes just asked me to finalize the logistics for tomorrow night's gala and check on your progress." "Progress is good," I said, dusting off my hands. "Tell him I don't want the antique clock in the foyer. He can keep it. Everything I want is in these 6 boxes. I've already arranged for movers to take them to the Chelsea place tomorrow morning." Liam blinked, his mouth slightly open. He had been the one to witness Elias's meltdowns for 3 years. He had been the one to gently pry Elias off the floor when Arthur refused to come home for their anniversary. He was expecting a weeping, hysterical Omega clinging to the door frames. Instead, he was looking at a man efficiently boxing up his trauma. "You're actually leaving," Liam said, the professionalism slipping for a fraction of a second. That's how divorces work, Liam, I said dryly. Now, about the gala. What time is the car coming? Liam quickly looked down at his tablet, visibly pulling himself together. The Maybach will be downstairs at 7 p.m. tomorrow. Mr. Hayes will ride with you. The red carpet walk is at 7:45 p.m. You are expected to sit at the head table until 9:30 p.m., after which you may exit discreetly. Perfect. Tell Arthur I'll be ready. Friday night arrived with the suffocating humidity of an impending storm. I spent an hour in the bathroom getting ready. I ignored the array of heavily scented Omega lotions, opting for unscented soap. I applied a heavy-duty medical scent blocker patch directly over my scent gland. It was an uncomfortable, sticky piece of silicone that alphas historically hated, as it completely muted an Omega's natural scent. It signaled unavailability. It signaled a closed door. I didn't care. I didn't want Arthur's biology reacting to mine. I wanted a clean slate. I dressed in the charcoal suit I'd salvaged from the closet. I paired it with a black turtleneck instead of a restrictive dress shirt and tie. The dark colors contrasted sharply with my pale skin and dark hair. I looked older. I looked sharper. I looked nothing like the soft, desperate boy Arthur had married. At exactly 6:55 p.m., I took the elevator down to the private garage. The black Maybach was idling. Liam stood by the rear passenger door. As I approached, Liam did a double-take, his eyes dragging up and down my outfit. "You look different, Mr. Reed," Liam said quietly. "I feel different. Is he inside?" Liam nodded, opening the door. I slid into the cavernous back seat. Arthur was already there, illuminated by the soft blue LED lighting of the interior. He was wearing a classic black tuxedo. He looked like he belonged on the cover of Forbes, ruthless and immaculate. He didn't look up from his phone as I buckled my seatbelt. "You're on time," Arthur noted, his voice flat. "A rare miracle," I replied, staring straight ahead at the privacy partition. The car pulled out into the Manhattan traffic. For the first 10 minutes, the silence was standard, but as the enclosed space heated up, I felt the shift. Arthur shifted his weight. I heard the faint rustle of his suit jacket. He inhaled deeply, a subtle flare of his nostrils. He was searching for it, the instinctual alpha habit of locating his Omega's scent to establish the baseline of the room. He couldn't find it. The scent blocker patch did its job perfectly. To Arthur's highly attuned senses, I was practically invisible, a blank space in the air. I saw him turn his head out of the corner of my eye. He stared at the side of my neck, his gaze locked onto the edge of the flesh-colored patch visible just above the collar of my black turtleneck. The air pressure in the car suddenly spiked. His pheromones flared, a sharp, irritated burst of winter chill that made my eyes water slightly. It wasn't conscious on his part. It was pure biological offense. An Omega in his territory, his legal spouse, actively blocking him out. "A scent patch?" Arthur asked. The low rumble of his voice held a dangerous edge that hadn't been there 2 days ago. "I had a mild headache," I lied smoothly, not turning to look at him. "The smell of jasmine makes me nauseous lately. Figured it was best for both of us." "It's a formal gala, Elias. People will notice." "People will notice a lot of things on Saturday morning when the press release drops," I replied, finally turning my head to meet his cold slate eyes. "Consider this a soft launch of our estrangement. Don't worry, I'll smile for the cameras. But in this car, I get to breathe." Arthur held my gaze. The muscle in his jaw ticked. He wanted to snap. He wanted to command. But he had absolutely no leverage left. The papers were signed. The boxes were packed. For the rest of the ride, Arthur Hayes didn't say another word. But his eyes never went back to his phone. They stayed locked on the black fabric of my turtleneck, right over the spot where my scent used to be. The Maybach rolled to a smooth halt outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The noise hit us before the doors even opened, a muffled roar of shouting photographers, idling engines, and the low, thrumming bass of string quartets echoing down the stone steps. A man in a sharp uniform opened my door. The humidity of the New York evening rushed in, instantly clashing with the aggressive air conditioning of the car. Flashbulbs erupted, turning the night into a stroboscopic nightmare. I stepped out first. In the past, this was the moment the original Elias would freeze, his anxiety spiking so hard you could smell the sour panic bleeding through his jasmine pheromones. He would wait for Arthur to emerge, clinging to the alpha's arm like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. I didn't wait. I adjusted the cuffs of my dark suit, kept my chin level, and turned to face the battery of cameras. I gave them a closed-mouth, polite smile, the exact expression I used to give the board of directors when they rejected a budget proposal. It was bulletproof and entirely hollow. Arthur stepped out a second later. He loomed at my side, the flashbulbs reflecting off his severe cheekbones. He offered his arm. It was a practiced robotic gesture. The script demanded we look like a united front. I didn't loop my arm through his and press my body weight against him. I simply rested my fingertips lightly on the fabric of his sleeve. Barely touching, a ghost's grip, Arthur's forearm twitched. He looked down at my hand, then up at my face. I didn't look back. I was already walking up the red carpet, setting a brisk pace that forced him to keep up. The inside of the museum was worse than the red carpet. It was a sea of bespoke tailoring, designer gowns, and a suffocating clash of elite pheromones. Alphas projecting power, Omegas projecting compliance, Betas swimming through the crossfire with tight smiles. Normally, Elias would have been a beacon of distress in this environment. His sweet, unregulated scent would have drawn every predatory eye in the room, forcing Arthur to constantly mark his territory with heavy, oppressive blasts of cedar and frost. It was an exhausting dynamic that only made Arthur resent Elias more. Tonight, the scent blocker on my neck held firm. I was an olfactory void. We made it to the VIP reception area near the Temple of Dender. A waiter offered a tray of champagne. I took a glass, took a sip, and immediately spotted the threat approaching. Wyatt Kensington. He was an Omega from a rival shipping family, married to a senator. In Elias's memories, Wyatt was a recurring nightmare. He was vicious, elegant, and took immense pleasure in reminding Elias that Arthur Hayes was out of his league. "Arthur, Elias," Wyatt purred, sliding into our orbit. He wore a silver silk suit and smelled intensely of crushed roses and expensive malice. "I didn't think you'd make it tonight. The rumor mill said you were indisposed, Elias. Something about a hospital trip?" The elite circle around us went dead silent. Everyone loved a car crash. Arthur stiffened beside me. The ambient temperature around him seemed to drop. He hated public messes. He opened his mouth, likely to deliver a cold, crushing dismissal to protect his PR image. I beat him to it. "Food poisoning," I said smoothly, taking another sip of champagne. I looked Wyatt dead in the eye. It was brutal. Though, judging by the fact that you're wearing the exact same Tom Ford suit you wore to the Met Gala in 2024, I'd say we're both struggling with recycling things that should have been thrown out. Someone in the circle choked on their drink. A sharp, muffled bark of laughter escaped a nearby beta. Wyatt's smile froze. His porcelain face flushed an ugly, mottled red. The heavy scent of roses soured instantly into wilted compost. Excuse me?" "It's a classic cut," I offered gently, tipping my glass toward him. "It forgives a lot. Enjoy your evening, Wyatt." I turned my back on him, dismissing him completely. I didn't look at Arthur. I just watched the reflections on the ancient stone of the temple, listening to the furious click of Wyatt's heels beating a hasty retreat. When I finally glanced sideways, Arthur was staring at me. His slate-gray eyes were wide, the pupils blown out slightly, fighting the harsh lighting of the museum. He wasn't projecting anger. He was projecting shock. "What was that?" Arthur asked. His voice was pitched low, barely audible over the string quartet. "That was me managing your public image," I replied, keeping my eyes on the crowd. "If you let him drag my name through the mud, it reflects poorly on Hayes Global. We don't have time for a scandal this close to the earnings report." "You don't talk like that. You cry when Wyatt corners you." "I used to do a lot of things," I said, finally looking up at him. "People change, Arthur. especially when they realize the script is getting canceled. The muscle in Arthur's jaw jumped. He looked at the stark black fabric covering my throat, right where my scent gland hid beneath the blocker. For the first time all night, his pheromones flared, not in defense of his territory, but in a strange, sharp burst of biological frustration. He wanted to smell me. He wanted to read my emotional state. He couldn't. I was a locked door. 2 hours, I reminded him quietly. Then we can both go home. Arthur didn't respond, but for the rest of the night, whenever someone approached our table, he stood just a fraction of an inch closer to my chair. It wasn't affection. It was a predator trying to figure out why his prey had suddenly grown teeth. Saturday morning, the headache from the gin had finally faded, replaced by the deep physical exhaustion of pretending to be someone else for a 4-hour gala. But there was no time to rest. The countdown clock in my head was ticking, 48 hours until Monday morning. The moving crew arrived at exactly 9 a.m. They were a discreet, high-end company that specialized in wealthy clients who didn't want their business broadcasted to the doormen. 4 guys in matching gray polos walked into the penthouse, carrying flat dollies and heavy-duty moving blankets. I stood in the foyer with a mug of black coffee, directing traffic. "Just the 6 boxes in the master closet," I told the foreman, pointing down the hall. "Everything else stays. Don't touch the furniture, don't touch the art, just the boxes." "Got it, Mr. Reed." It was terrifyingly fast. 3 years of a man's life, boxed up and wheeled out on rubber tires in less than 15 minutes. The original Elias had spent hours agonizing over every piece of decor in this penthouse, trying to turn a sterile architectural showcase into a home. He had bought the throw pillows. He had picked out the heavy curtains. Now, none of it mattered. It was just a hotel room I was finally checking out of. I was washing my coffee mug in the kitchen sink when Arthur emerged from his study. He wore dark slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked disheveled, a rare sight. Usually, Arthur spent his Saturdays at the office, aggressively ignoring his domestic life. Today, he had stayed home. He stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching the last mover wheel a dolly carrying 2 boxes out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut with a final, echoing thud. Silence descended on the penthouse. The heavy, oppressive silence of a tomb. I dried the mug with a towel, set it perfectly on the drying rack, and turned to face him. "That's everything," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. Arthur's eyes tracked my movements. He looked from the empty foyer back to me. "I expected you to take more. The jewelry, the watches, the things I bought you. You bought those things for your husband to wear to galas so you'd look like a generous alpha," I corrected him calmly. "I don't need a $100,000 Patek Philippe to check the time in a grocery store, Arthur. Leave them in the safe. Sell them. Give them to your next contract spouse. They aren't mine." Arthur took a slow step into the kitchen. His pheromones were restless today. Not the freezing, aggressive blasts of yesterday, but a low, rolling wave of cedar that smelled confused. It smelled like a man trying to find a footing on ice. "You're making a point," Arthur said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, rumbling baritone. "You think leaving the jewelry behind makes you look noble. You think it's a statement." I laughed, a genuine short bark of amusement. "Arthur, not everything is a negotiation tactic," I said, leaning against the cold marble counter. "I'm not playing 4D chess with you. I'm just leaving. The $50 million in the settlement is more than enough. Keeping your watches would just be greedy." He stopped 10 feet away from me. He stared at me with an intensity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The biological urge to submit, to bare my neck and let the alpha win, flared in the back of my mind. It was Elias's ghost, still clinging to the hardware of this brain. I ruthlessly shoved the instinct down. "Where is the ring, Elias?" The question caught me off guard. I looked down at my left hand. The platinum band was gone. "It's on the nightstand in the master bedroom," I answered. "Next to the lamp." Arthur's jaw tightened. "The contract states we remain legally married until Monday at 9 a.m. And until Monday at 9 a.m., I won't sleep with anyone else," I deadpanned. I think the PR department can survive me taking off a piece of metal 24 hours early in the privacy of my own home. Or, well, your home. I pushed off the counter. I reached into the pocket of my jeans. Real jeans, rough denim, not the soft, pathetic cashmere the original Elias used to wear, and pulled out the heavy electronic key fob for the penthouse. I walked over to the kitchen island and set the fob down on the black marble. It made a sharp clack. Liam has the details for the Chelsea place if your lawyers need to send any final documents, I said. I'll be there. Arthur stared at the key fob. He didn't reach for it. He didn't move. Goodbye, Arthur. I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned and walked toward the foyer. I didn't look back. I didn't pause at the door to frame a dramatic silhouette. I just opened it, stepped into the private elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. As the steel doors slid shut, the last thing I saw was Arthur Hayes standing frozen in the middle of his pristine, empty kitchen, staring at a plastic key fob as if it were a bomb about to go off. The Chelsea penthouse was exactly what $50 million bought you in Manhattan. Unnecessary square footage, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view that made you feel like a god. It was also, thankfully, entirely empty of Arthur Hayes. I spent Sunday morning unpacking. It didn't take long. 6 boxes held very little life. I filled the sparse closet. I put a toothbrush in the master bathroom. And then, for the first time since waking up in this bizarre Omegaverse reality, I sat down on the massive cream-colored sofa and just breathed. No heavy cedar pheromones pushing against my lungs. No walking on eggshells. No waiting for a man who was never going to come home. I ordered a frankly obscene amount of Chinese takeout. When it arrived, I ate it straight out of the cartons with chopsticks, sitting cross-legged on the expensive hardwood floor, watching the sunset bleed orange and purple across the Hudson River. This was survival. This was winning. I had bypassed the tragedy of the original Elias's life and skipped straight to the golden parachute. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., the lawyers would file the paperwork. At 10 a.m., Hayes Global would release a sanitized statement about our mutual separation. By noon, I would be a free man with a bank account that looked like a phone number. I was just finishing the last of the lo mein when the intercom buzzed. The sharp noise made me jump. I frowned, setting the carton down. The concierge downstairs had strict instructions not to let anyone up without calling my cell first. I walked over to the security panel on the wall and pressed the video button. The screen flickered to life. Standing in the lobby, looking utterly out of place next to a potted fern, was Liam. I pressed the talk button. Liam, it's Sunday night. Doesn't Arthur pay you enough to have a weekend? Liam jumped slightly, looking at the camera. Mr. Reed, I apologize for the intrusion, but Mr. Hayes he's in the lobby. He requested I bring him here. My stomach dropped. The familiar phantom ache of Elias's anxiety flared in my chest. I took a deep breath, squashing it. Send him up, I said flatly. Just him. I didn't bother changing. I was wearing an old gray t-shirt and loose sweatpants. I was barefoot. My hair was a mess. Let the great Arthur Hayes see exactly what he was divorcing. 3 minutes later, the private elevator in the foyer dinged. The doors slid open. Arthur stepped into my apartment. He was out of his corporate armor. He wore a dark charcoal sweater and dark jeans, but the casual clothes didn't soften him. He still looked like a thunderstorm confined to a human body. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air pressure in the room changed. His pheromones flooded the space, cedar and frost, but heavier today. Agitated, spiking with a jagged, nervous energy that I'd never smelled on him before. He stopped in the foyer, his slate eyes scanning the apartment. He took in the empty walls, the unmade sofa, the empty takeout cartons on the floor. He looked at my bare feet. You're eating on the floor, Arthur observed. His voice sounded strained. Dining table hasn't been delivered yet, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. To what do I owe the pleasure, Arthur? It's 7 p.m. on a Sunday. We signed the papers in 14 hours. Did the lawyers find a typo? Arthur didn't answer immediately. He reached into the pocket of his jeans. Slowly, he pulled his hand out and opened his fist. Resting on his broad palm was the platinum wedding band. "You left this," he said. I stared at the ring. Then I looked up at his face. He was entirely serious. He had driven across the city on a Sunday evening to hand-deliver a piece of jewelry I had explicitly told him I was abandoning. "I know I left it," I said, speaking slowly, as if talking to a difficult child. "I told you I left it. On the nightstand." "It's yours. It belongs to you." "It belongs to Hayes Global's PR department," I corrected him. "Arthur, why are you really here?" His jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck stood out in sharp relief. The scent of frost in the air grew biting, stinging the inside of my nose even through the blocker patch on my neck. He was angry, but beneath the anger, there was something frantic. A predator that had suddenly realized the cage door was open and the bird had already flown miles away. "You changed," Arthur said. The words tore out of him, harsh and accusatory. "You woke up on Wednesday and you were someone else." "I woke up on Wednesday and realized I was dying," I shot back, dropping the polite, detached act. My voice echoed in the empty penthouse. "I woke up and realized I had spent 3 years starving myself, shrinking myself, begging for a single scrap of human decency from a man who looks at me like a rounding error on a balance sheet. So yeah, I changed." Arthur flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a slight tightening of his shoulders, but in the alpha language of absolute control, it was the equivalent of a scream. "I never asked you to starve," he said quietly. "You never asked me to exist," I countered. I walked closer to him, stopping just outside the aggressive radius of his pheromones. I looked him dead in the eye. "You fulfilled your grandfather's will. You got your shares. You got your obedient little Omega trophy to trot out for the cameras. And now you get your clean divorce. You won, Arthur. You got everything you wanted. Then why does it feel like you're the one leaving me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and jagged. Arthur stared at me, his chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. The great untouchable CEO looked entirely unmoored. For 3 years he had held all the power. He had dictated the terms of Elias's misery. Now I was setting the terms of my own freedom, and it was tearing his biological wiring apart. I looked at the ring in his hand. I reached out and plucked it from his palm. His skin was burning hot against my cold fingertips. "Because I am," I said softly. I walked over to the kitchen counter, dropped the heavy platinum band into a ceramic bowl meant for keys, and turned back to face him. "Go home, Arthur. I'll see you at 9 a.m. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hayes Global boardroom, distorting the Manhattan skyline into a gray, weeping blur. I sat at the far end of a mahogany table that could easily seat 30 people. The leather chair was too big for me. The room was aggressively air-conditioned, humming with a sterile, recycled chill. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table, watching the digital clock on the wall tick toward 9 a.m. Opposite me sat a row of 3 lawyers in identical dark suits. They looked like undertakers. They were shuffling papers, speaking in hushed, reverent tones, completely ignoring my existence. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a depreciating asset being written off the company's ledger. The heavy double doors opened at exactly 8:59 a.m. Hayes walked in. He didn't look like a man about to secure a massive financial victory. He looked like he hadn't slept since he left my apartment last night. His suit was immaculate, but the tie was knotted a fraction too tightly, and the dark shadows under his slate eyes were pronounced. The air pressure in the room immediately dropped. His pheromones hit the space like a physical shockwave, crushed cedar and sub-zero frost, sharp and deeply unregulated. The beta lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, instinctively pulling at their collars. I didn't flinch. I had swallowed 2 heavy-duty scent suppressants with my coffee an hour ago. My biology was practically dormant. I was a ghost haunting a boardroom. Hayes didn't sit down immediately. He stood at the head of the table, his eyes locking onto me. He was searching my face, looking for the crack in the ice. He wanted the trembling lip. He wanted the desperate plea. I gave him a polite, flat nod. "Good morning." The lead lawyer cleared his throat. a nervous, dry sound. "Gentlemen, we are here to execute the final dissolution of marriage. The settlement funds have been placed in escrow. The title deed for the Chelsea property has been transferred. Once these documents are signed, the legal separation is immediate." He slid a thick stack of papers across the polished mahogany. It stopped exactly between Hayes and me. "Mr. Reed," the lawyer said, holding out a silver pen. "If you would." I didn't take his pen. I pulled a cheap black plastic ballpoint out of my jacket pocket. It cost 99 cents at a bodega downstairs. I clicked it with my thumb. The loud plastic clack echoed in the silent room. I pulled those papers toward me. I didn't read them again. I flipped directly to the last page, flattened the seam with my left hand, and signed my name. Quick, efficient, no hesitation. I pushed the stack back toward the center of the table. "Your turn," I said. Hayes stared at the signature. The blue ink from his lawyer's previous drafts was gone, replaced by the stark, cheap black ink of my ballpoint. He reached out slowly and picked up the silver pen the lawyer had offered. He gripped it. His knuckles turned white. Seconds ticked by. The only sound in the room was the rain hammering against the glass and the nervous, shallow breathing of the legal team. "Sir?" the lead lawyer prompted gently. "The press release is scheduled for 10 o'clock. We need the signature to finalize the filings." Hayes didn't move. The cedar scent in the room was growing volatile, twisting into something bitter and suffocating. His alpha biology was screaming at him, violently rejecting the physical act of releasing a mate, even one he despised. It was pure instinct warring with corporate logic. "Sign it, Hayes," I said quietly. His head snapped up. His eyes met mine, dark and turbulent. "You're making a mistake," he ground out, his voice a low, vibrating threat. "You have no idea how to survive in this city without my name attached to you." "I survived 24 years before you," I replied, leaning back in the oversized leather chair. "I'll survive the next 60 just fine. Sign the paper. You're holding up my morning." The blunt dismissal felt like a physical blow. I watched it land. I watched the great, untouchable CEO realize that the power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had entirely inverted. He wasn't discarding me, I was firing him, his jaw locked. He looked down at the document, pressed the silver pen to the paper, and slashed his name across the line. The stroke was aggressive enough to tear the heavy parchment. He threw the pen on the table. It clattered against the wood. "Done," Hayes said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. The mask was back in place. The ice had frozen over. "Congratulations," I said. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. I didn't wait for the lawyers to pack up their briefcases. I didn't wait for handshakes. I turned my back on the apex predator of Manhattan and walked toward the double doors. "Elias." His voice stopped me just as my hand hit the brass handle. I didn't turn around. "You'll call," Hayes stated to my back. It wasn't a question. It was a desperate assertion of a reality that no longer existed. "When the money isn't enough to fill the empty apartment, you'll call." I opened the door, letting the noise of the busy executive floor bleed into the sterile tomb of the boardroom. "Lose my number," I said, and walked out. Freedom doesn't feel like flying. It feels like a sudden absence of gravity. It takes a while to realize you aren't falling. You're just untethered. A month passed. The PR statement dropped exactly on schedule, a sterile, sanitized paragraph in the business section of the Times that framed the divorce as a mutual and amicable transition. The media briefly cared, generated a few clickbait articles about the mysterious tragic Omega who couldn't keep his alpha, and then moved on to the next scandal. I settled into the Chelsea penthouse. I bought real furniture, dark leather, reclaimed wood, things with weight and texture. I also bought a camera, a Sony A5100. It wasn't the most expensive piece of hardware on the market, but it felt right in my hands. The heavy, mechanical reality of it grounded me. I spent my mornings walking the High Line, learning the machine. I switched the drive mode from a basic single shot to continuous burst. It was a revelation. In single shot, you had to anticipate the moment. You had to predict reality. In burst mode, you held the shutter down and let the camera chew through frames, capturing the violent, messy, rapid-fire reality of life exactly as it happened. I photographed the exact fraction of a second a pigeon's wing snapped open. I caught the blurred, frenetic anger of a cab driver cursing at a cyclist. I captured life moving fast, unscripted, and completely out of anyone's control. It was the antithesis of the stifling, hyper-controlled environment I had escaped. But photography was just a hobby to quiet the lingering anxiety of the original Elias's biology. My mind, the cold, calculating brain of a 30-something middle manager who had clawed his way up a corporate ladder in a past life, needed something to chew on. So I started digging. I used a fraction of the divorce settlement to quietly hire an independent financial analyst. I set up a shell company in Delaware, and I began aggressively auditing Hayes Global's public filings. Hayes was a shark, but even sharks have blind spots. His blind spot was a mid-sized logistics subsidiary operating out of the Midwest. Hayes Global was quietly trying to acquire it to monopolize a new shipping route before the quarterly earnings report in late September. It was a smart play, but it was sloppy. The subsidiary had a fractured board of directors, and two of the key shareholders were bleeding money in private ventures. I didn't need $50 million to be happy, but I did need insurance. I needed to ensure that Hayes would never, ever view me as easy prey again. Through my shell company, I reached out to those two bleeding shareholders. I offered them a premium for their voting rights, a quiet, cash-heavy buyout that slipped completely under Hayes Global's radar. It took 3 weeks of relentless, anonymous negotiation. By the first week of September, I held a blocking minority in the exact subsidiary Hayes desperately needed. I loved the strategy of it. I loved the chess game. What I didn't love was the logistical nightmare of celebrating. I had always loved the idea of traveling, of packing a bag and vanishing into a foreign city. But the reality of booking flights, vetting hotels, and managing itineraries exhausted me. So I outsourced it. I hired a high-end concierge service. I want 3 weeks in Europe, I told the agent over the phone, pacing my living room while holding the Sony A5100 in my left hand. Start in Rome, end in Prague. I don't care how you get me there. Just build the itinerary, book the tickets, and send me a PDF of where I need to stand and when. I want to shoot architecture. Life was finally settling into a rhythm, until the third Thursday of the month. I was sitting at my kitchen island editing raw files on my laptop when my burner phone buzzed. The caller ID was a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, the screen lit up again. Liam? I stared at the name. Liam had no reason to call me. The legal ties were severed. The assets were transferred. I picked up the phone and hit answer. Liam, if you're calling to ask for a recipe, you have the wrong number. Mr. Reed. Liam's voice sounded ragged. The professional veneer was entirely stripped away. He sounded like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship. I am deeply sorry for contacting you. I know the boundaries that were set. Then why are you violating them? Because he's losing his mind. I stopped scrolling through the photos on my laptop. Be specific. Mr. Hayes, Liam breathed out, the words rushed and frantic. His rut. It hit 3 days ago. It's uncharacteristically violent. The suppressants aren't working. He's locked himself in the penthouse. He's destroying the furniture, and the medical team is threatening to sedate him. I leaned back in my chair. A rut. The alpha biological cycle. Usually, alphas managed it cleanly with clinical suppressants or hired companions. But a rut triggered by the forced biological severance of a mate? That was different. That was primal warfare. Call a doctor, Liam. I'm not a pharmacist. He doesn't want a doctor. Liam's voice cracked. He's tearing the master closet apart. He's looking for something that smells like you. But you took everything. You threw it all away. There's nothing left, and his biology is tearing him apart because he thinks his mate is dead. A cold, heavy silence stretched over the line. Elias's ghost flared in my chest. A pathetic, whining urge to run to him, to bare my neck, to soothe the angry alpha. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripped the edge of the kitchen island, and crushed the instinct into dust. I am not his mate, I said smoothly, my voice devoid of an ounce of pity. I'm a shareholder in a shell company. I'm a photographer. I'm a stranger. Tell the medics to use the heavy sedatives. And Liam? Yes? He whispered. If you ever call this number again, I'll buy the PR firm that manages your career and have you blacklisted from every corporate office in Manhattan. Good luck. I hung up. I dropped the phone into a glass of water on the counter, watching the screen short out and go dark. It took Hayes exactly 10 days to track me down. I knew it was coming. You don't trigger a biological meltdown in an apex predator and expect him to just walk away once the fever breaks. He was going to come looking for the cause of his pain. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at a corner table in a high-end, violently overpriced cafe in Soho. The walls were exposed brick, the espresso tasted like dirt, and the clientele was entirely made up of models and trust fund kids. It was the perfect neutral ground. No corporate advantage, no home court territorial pheromones. I was reviewing the final PDF of my European itinerary on my tablet when the ambient noise in the cafe abruptly died. The low hum of conversation just stopped. I didn't have to look up to know why. The barometric pressure dropped. The scent of crushed cedar and frost rolled through the room, heavy and oppressive. It wasn't the frantic, aggressive spike of a man in a rut. It was the cold, calculated spread of an alpha demanding complete submission from his environment. I took a slow sip of my terrible espresso, placed the cup down precisely on the saucer, and raised my eyes. Hayes stood just inside the door. He looked devastating. The shadows under his eyes were darker, his cheekbones sharper. He had lost weight. The tailored navy suit hung differently on his frame. The aura of untouchable perfection was gone, replaced by something rougher, more dangerous. He looked like a man who had survived a car crash and walked away from the wreckage. His slate eyes locked onto me. He crossed the room in long, measured strides. He stopped at my table. He didn't ask for permission. He pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down. "You changed your phone number," Hayes said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual smooth baritone. "I dropped it in a glass of water," I replied, not breaking eye contact. "It was an accident, mostly." Hayes leaned forward, resting his forearms on the small circular table. The proximity forced his scent over me. It was a deliberate tactic. He was trying to overwhelm my senses, trying to drag the submissive Omega out of hiding. I breathed in deeply through my nose, letting the cedar fill my lungs. It didn't make me tremble. It just made me annoyed. "You look well," Hayes noted, his eyes tracking the line of my jaw, the expensive, casual black turtleneck, the relaxed posture. He sounded almost bitter. "50 million goes a long way towards skin care," I deadpanned. "What do you want?" "I have a flight to Rome on Friday, and I still need to buy walking shoes." Hayes flinched at the mention of Rome. The idea of me leaving the continent, putting an ocean between us, seemed to physically pain him. "I want to know what happened to you," he demanded softly. "The boy I married wouldn't have survived 5 minutes in that boardroom. The boy I married wouldn't have left the jewelry, and he certainly wouldn't have bought a controlling block of shares in Orion Logistics under a dummy corporation in Delaware." Ah, there it was. The real reason for the visit. I smiled. It was a slow, sharp thing that didn't reach my eyes. "You found out about Orion." "My acquisition team spent a week trying to figure out why the board suddenly went hostile," Hayes said, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. "They traced the buyout to a shell company. They traced the shell company to a private wealth manager. They traced the manager to you. You bought the blocking rights to my supply chain." "I did." "Why?" he demanded, slamming a palm flat on the table. The espresso cups rattled. Several people at nearby tables quickly looked away, intimidated by the sudden flare of alpha aggression. "Because you taught me that the only language this world understands is leverage," I said smoothly, leaning in to match his proximity. "For 3 years, you held my life in your hands because you controlled the narrative. You controlled the money. You controlled the affection." I tapped my index finger against the wooden table. You thought you were discarding a broken toy, but the problem with breaking things, Hayes, is that sometimes the pieces that shatter are the only things holding the monster back. He stared at me, his pupils blown wide. He was looking at a stranger wearing his husband's face. The realization was finally sinking in. The absolute, unshakable power he had wielded was gone. I wasn't just immune to his pheromones. I was actively dismantling his empire. "I need that subsidiary," Hayes said, the command in his voice fracturing into something that sounded dangerously close to a plea. "I know. What do you want for it? Double the market value. A seat on the Hayes Global Board." "I don't want your money. I have plenty. And I certainly don't want a seat at your table." I picked up my tablet and locked the screen. "I bought those shares to prove a point. You spent 3 years treating me like I was invisible. Now, you're going to have to look at me every time you read a quarterly earnings report." Hayes looked wrecked. The invincible CEO was drowning in a coffee shop in Soho. "Elias," he whispered. It was the first time he had said my name without it sounding like an insult. It sounded like a prayer. "Please, come back to the penthouse. We can renegotiate the terms. We can start over." It was the apology the original Elias had literally died for. It was the moment of poetic justice, the grand reversal, the alpha finally brought to his knees. It made me feel absolutely nothing. "No," I said simply. I stood up. I didn't rush. I slung my camera strap over my shoulder and looked down at the man who used to be my whole world. "The script changed, Hayes, and you've been written out." I walked out of the cafe, stepping into the bright, chaotic sunlight of the Manhattan streets. I took a deep breath of the city air, exhaust fumes, hot asphalt, and expensive perfume. It smelled like absolute, untouchable freedom. And as I blended into the crowd, completely anonymous, I reached down, switched the Sony A5100 to burst mode, and started taking pictures. The tables haven't just turned, they've been completely flipped. If you loved watching Elias strip this power away from an untouchable alpha and build his own empire from the ashes of a broken marriage, hit that like button right now. This is what true poetic justice looks like. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next series, where we dive into even darker corporate betrayals and hidden identities. Drop a comment below. If you were Elias, would you have sold the shares back or watched Hayes Global burn? Share this video with someone who loves a ruthless revenge story.